Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for June 23rd, 2021. Today I'm going to concentrate on some developments that have occurred in the days following the summit in Geneva between Presidents Putin and Biden. There have been some very interesting signs that the communique, which indicated a joint commitment to moving back away from the issues that were putting us on a course toward war, possibly nuclear war, that there are some signs that those intentions are continuing. But there's still a number of problems that have to be resolved that are looming in the background, and that's why the follow-up discussions are so crucial. Now, most interesting is an article that was placed by President Putin in Die Zeit magazine in Germany, which is in commemoration of the 80th anniversary of the launching of Operation Barbarossa, the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. What Putin writes in this article is that he's reiterating that the promises that were made by the West of no NATO expansion after the fall of the Soviet Union were violated repeatedly, as NATO more than doubled its size by adding a number of Eastern European states, and then after 2014, toying with the idea of bringing Ukraine into NATO. The idea that there would be Western troops on the borders of Russia, despite the end of the Cold War. Now, what he points out is that promises were broken. But then he said, what we need to cooperate on instead is an open economic space, a common economic space. This is a reference to Charles de Gaulle's idea of a union of nations, of sovereign nations from the Atlantic to the Urals. De Gaulle had a very different view from that of the European Union, of one state in which all sovereign nations subordinate their interests to what is essentially a bureaucratic center in Brussels. De Gaulle's idea was that there should be a real collaboration to develop the area from the Atlantic to the Urals as an economic space in which all nations can participate, but on the basis of their sovereign needs and sovereign interests, not by giving those up for some phony sense of unity. And the fact that Putin is referring back to that is quite significant. And what he wrote in this article is, we simply cannot afford to carry the burden of past misunderstandings, hard feelings, conflicts, and mistakes, which is, in a sense, what is the expansion of NATO today, with all the vile language against Russia, the phony accusations, the evidence-free charges, and so on. And Putin said this carrying the burden of the past misunderstandings prevents us from concentrating on the challenges at hand. And he said, instead, we must recognize the mistakes and correct them. Toward that end, the Russian ambassador to the United States, Antonov, has now returned to Washington. He left, as did the U.S. ambassador to Moscow, leave their posts in the height of the Ukraine crisis in the period of April of this past year. And Antonov said, we have no option but to engage in dialogue. And on this, he quoted Putin, who said that the U.S. and Russia bear special responsibility for international peace and security. Also, State Department spokesman Ned Price announced that preparations for this dialogue on strategic stability are underway. This includes questions of arms control, the START agreement, the follow-up to that, and so on, but also how to address the dangers or the risks that confrontation could be stirred up again by the ongoing unresolved problems. Now, these problems remain, and the agreement reached in Geneva by no means has stopped the war hawks from their relentless pressure on the U.S. presidency to move against Russia and against China. The Navalny sanctions, a new round of these are about to be done, about to be issued. Now, this idea of sanctions, we've talked about this quite a bit, but sanctions are a form of war. The idea that you're trying to resolve diplomatic problems by imposing sanctions based on allegations coming from the intelligence community, which has a notorious record of operating on behalf of the military-industrial complex to create confrontation, is absurd. And so the idea that these sanctions are going to be extended, that there will still be an effort to shut down the Nord Stream 2 pipeline and any other number of confrontational points, these have to be resolved without resorting to methods of economic warfare. And this includes especially dealing with Syria. And it includes the solution, the resolution to the war in Afghanistan, pulling out troops, also NATO troops, and not replacing those forces by putting troops in Pakistan. The Pakistani Prime Minister Khan announced yesterday that Pakistan does not want U.S. troops in Pakistan because that's not the way to resolve the problems that exist there. So we're seeing the continuing pressure from the British Empire and its followers among the political networks in the U.S. Congress, the so-called Bipartisan Consensus against Russia and China, as well as the think tanks, the media especially, which won't be content unless we're on the verge of war. And this includes huge spending, it includes deployment of troops around the world, and so on. Keep in mind, when President Trump tried to move against this, he drew opposition not just from Democrats, because there are a lot of war hawks in the Democratic Party, but from the hardcore war hawks in the Republican Party and the defense establishment. If we're going to end these wars, we have to do it through dialogue with the great powers, especially Russia, China, and the United States, and also hopefully India can be brought into this discussion. Toward this end, people like Jake Sullivan, who seems to speak out of both sides of his mouth, has to be brought into the reality of the situation. He talked right after the summit of possibly having a similar summit between Biden and Xi Jinping of China. But then yesterday he talked about the U.S. needing to isolate China if the U.S. intelligence community is not allowed access to the COVID lab in Wuhan to investigate the origins of COVID. And a Chinese spokesman made the obvious point. This is politicizing the issue. This is a matter of science. Bring international scientists in to cooperate on this. Don't bring U.S. intelligence specialists who have already proven their willingness to lie for the sake of creating confrontation. And remember, the reports that have come out recently that refurbished this story that it was the Chinese who created the COVID virus and unleashed it on the world, the origin of those reports came from one journalist, Michael Gordon, writing in the Wall Street Journal, who's the same Michael Gordon who insisted that Iraq possessed weapons of mass destruction, backing the British and the Bush administration's desire to go into Iraq in 2002. Again, he was wrong then. His story about 3 Chinese scientists having flu-like symptoms, well, the Chinese said they've made the medical records of those doctors or workers available, and they do not include symptoms of COVID. The other source of the renewed push comes from Pompeo's team at the State Department and CIA. And we know that Pompeo was gung-ho on a confrontation with China. And I know Jon Stewart came out and did his bit on Stephen Colbert's show. Well, Stewart, unfortunately, was pushing the line of people who usually he is astute enough to know you shouldn't trust. And I'm talking about people like Pompeo and journalists like Gordon. That's why it's so important that we have a conference coming up this weekend, the Schiller Institute, to address all these bigger strategic issues from the standpoint of science, cooperation, and moving to a new paradigm of peaceful economic development. this is a chance for citizens to get involved in breaking the media control of the narrative. People complain all the time, you can't trust the media, they lie, my friends believe them. Well, participate in our conference. Equip yourself with the ability to navigate through the narrative to get to the truth. That's the starting point for being effective in changing the thinking of your fellow citizens. Instead of bipartisan commitment to war, we need an American population that's clear on who's trying to keep us in these wars, who's trying to start new wars, and what are they doing to destroy the economy so Americans are willingly able to put aside their economic concerns and instead concentrate on an enemy. That's the strategy of the British Empire. That's the psychological warfare that's being run against you right now. So go to schillerinstitute.com, sign up for our conference this weekend. It's Saturday the 26th and Sunday the 27th, 4 panels. I'm sure you'll find it not just interesting, but highly useful, and you'll probably regret if you haven't organized your friends to join you in participating in the conference. It's online and it's free. So thanks for joining me today, and I'll be back again tomorrow.